The Giant in the Cave. So, Odysseus and his men have just left the island of the Lotus Eaters. They rescued their 3 men who ate the terrible fruit, and they went back on their ships. A thick fog came. They just kind of wandered around sailing because they didn't know where they were going because of the fog. And then suddenly they feel the boats on land. So they stagger out completely exhausted. They walk up to where they feel the dry sand and they just completely pass out from exhaustion. They don't even know where they are. The third chapter is The Giant in the Cave. They awoke to a beautiful, clear dawn and a fine view. Their ships had run aground in a natural harbor, safely away from the wild open sea. Behind the harbor was a stretch of rich grassland with luxuriant woods beyond. The place seemed to have everything they needed. Huge bunches of grapes grew on wild vines, and a spring of fresh water ran down into the harbor. Looking up at the wooded hills, Odysseus saw a herd of wild goats leaping from rock to rock. "Ah, the gods must have brought us here," he said. He and his men took their bows and spears and went off to hunt the goats. In a very short time, they had enough meat to last for days, and they discovered that the island was uninhabited. At last, it was safe to rest and relax. They feasted on roasted meat, washed down with wine they'd looted from the Caconis. Afterward, they lay on the beach, gazing across to the mainland. They heard the sound of voices drifting over the water and the bleating of sheep and goats. And they saw smoke rising into the evening sky from fires like theirs. Idly, as the sun went down, they wondered what kind of people lived over there. They peered across the dark shore, but no human figures were visible. And however hard they tried, they could not make out what the voices were saying. Still listening, the sailors fell asleep one by one beside the embers of their fires. Only Odysseus stayed awake, looking across the water. As the sky grew black and the stars came out, he stared at the glimmering light of the distant fires. What was over there? Whose voices could they hear? As soon as the sun rose, Odysseus was on his feet giving orders to his men as they awoke. 11 ships must stay here to take on food and fresh water, he said. But I'll take my own ship over to the mainland to see what sort of people live there. He signaled to his crew and they followed him into the water. Clambering on board their ship, they took up their oars. It wasn't worth raising the sail, so they rowed the short distance to the opposite shore. Because they were rowing, they were facing backward. It was only when they turned the ship, ready to anchor, that they had their first look at the place where they were going to land. It was a strange, unsettling sight. A little way back from the shore, they saw the entrance to a vast cave, shadowed by laurel bushes. In front of the cave was a huge sheep pen made of great blocks of rough-cut stone. Every block was taller than a man. What kind of creature could build like that? The sailors glanced nervously at one another, and someone muttered that they ought to row straight back to the island. But Odysseus was curious. He bit his lip thoughtfully, making a plan. Most of you must stay and guard the ship, he said. I'll take 12 men with me to explore the cave. He chose 12 of the best and bravest and ordered them to pack up some food. Then he filled a big wineskin with rich, strong wine and jumped into the water to wade ashore. He and his 12 companions crept up the beach toward the towering sheep pen. Peering through a crack in the wall, they saw that it was full of lambs, but there were no adult sheep. Odysseus guessed that the main flock was up in the high pastures with their shepherd, whoever he was. Whatever he was. That gave them a chance to explore the cave. Odysseus crept cautiously up to the entrance, beckoning his men to follow. And here we see the cave, the men going into the entrance of the cave. When their eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, they saw an amazing sight. The cave was high and very deep, and it was full of gigantic baskets and bowls. The baskets were filled with cheeses the size of cartwheels, and the bowls were brimming with milk and whey. "Look at all this food," cried one of the sailors. "There are enough cheeses and lambs to last us all the way back to Ithaca." "We don't need to come as looters," Odysseus said. "I've brought gifts for the owner of this cave. He'll give us gifts in return out of politeness, and then we'll have all the meat and cheese we need. And we'll have made a new friend, not an enemy." His men were still nervous, but he persuaded them to stay. Taking dry wood from a stack at the back of the cave, they built themselves a fire and settled down to wait for the owner to return. They heard him before they saw him. Thud, thud, thud. His footsteps shook the ground ahead of him. In 3 strides, he had reached the cave and he was driving his sheep inside. A huge bundle of firewood flew in after them, and then came the giant himself. His massive body blocked out the light as he stooped to walk through the entrance. Who do you think those people are down there? Maybe the underworld or something? They're underground. We see some burrowing and tunneling insects. We see some stalactites and stalagmites in the cave. The huge bowls of cheese, baskets of cheese, and bowls of milk and whey. I don't know who those people are. Probably Odysseus and his men. When Odysseus and his men saw that vast, dark shape, they rushed to the back of the cave to hide in the shadows. By the time they turned around to take another look, the monster was blocking the entrance of cave with a great slab of stone. They were trapped. I know I would be terrified if I was trapped in a cave and saw that huge figure there, blocking the entrance. Shivering in their corner, they watched him sniff at the dying embers of their fire. His massive head turned left and right, peering around. Then he heaped more wood onto the fire. The flames shot up, and they saw his face for the first time. It was broad and ugly, with a jutting nose and a thick, heavy jaw. In the center of his forehead was a single, hideous eye, his only one. They were trapped in the cave of a Cyclops. Now that's neat. They have little cave drawings and stuff. Cyclops has little cave drawings in his cave. Oh, look how easy he just picked up those men. Oh, no. The monster milked his sheep, guzzling down the first bucketful in a single gulp. He sat the rest of the milk aside to curdle for making cheese. Then he built up the fire again, piling the wood so high that the red glare lit up the cave. This time he looked around more carefully, searching for intruders. When he saw Odysseus and his men, he bellowed, "Sheep stealers!" "We're not thieves," Odysseus said, stepping forward boldly. "We're Greek soldiers, sailing home from the war in Troy." The Cyclops peered suspiciously at him. "Sailing? Where's your ship, then?" Odysseus certainly wasn't going to tell him that. He made a sad face and gazed up at the giant. "Our ship was wrecked," he said. "Poseidon, the earth shaker, whipped up a great storm and swamped it, and we are the only men who didn't drown. Please, give us food and shelter." The Cyclops laughed scornfully. Instead of answering, he reached out and grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men. Cramming them into his mouth, he gulped them down, grinning. as the other sailors shouted in horror. Then he guzzled another bucketful of milk and sprawled on the floor, falling asleep immediately. His body was like a mountain, filling half the cave. As soon as he started to snore, Odysseus darted forward, ready to draw his sword. I can climb up his arm, he thought, and stab him while he's asleep. The sword was halfway out of its scabbard before he realized how stupid he would be to use it. If he killed the Cyclops, who would let them out of the cave? He and all his men working together would never be able to move the stone that blocked the entrance. Only the Cyclops was strong enough for that. Without him, they would be trapped in the cave forever, doomed to a slow death by starvation. They had to escape. If they didn't, the Cyclops would eat them all, but they couldn't get out of the cave without his help. How could they trick him into doing that? All night, Odysseus lay awake and thought, working out one plan after another. By morning, he knew what he was going to do, but it wouldn't be easy. The Cyclops had no intention of setting them free. When he awoke, he snatched 2 more of the men and ate them for his breakfast. Then he rolled the stone away and drove his sheep out of the cave. But he kept a constant watch on Odysseus and his companions to stop them from sneaking out with the sheep. As soon as the whole flock was outside, he followed, grinning cruelly as he pushed the stone back into place. Odysseus waited until the thunderous footsteps had died away in the distance. Then he took a long pole that was leaning against the wall of the cave. This is the weapon we're going to use to defeat the Cyclops, he said. As he explained the plan to his companions, he used his sword to cut a long piece off of the pole. He sharpened it to a point, then held the sharpened end in the fire to harden it. Then he hid the finished weapon at the back of the cave, ready for when the Cyclops returned. It was evening before they heard his terrible feet coming back. Thud, thud, thud. The stone was dragged away from the mouth of the cave, and in came the sheep. The Cyclops lumbered after them, pulling the stone into place behind him. The evening went the same way as the one before. The Cyclops milked his sheep and swilled down 2 bucketfuls of milk. Then he grabbed 2 sailors for his supper, crunching their bones as he chewed them up. It was a horrific sight, but Odysseus and the rest of his companions forced themselves to stay quiet. Soon they would have their revenge. When the Cyclops had finished eating, he settled himself down beside the fire. That was the moment Odysseus had been waiting for. Filling a drinking bowl with the strong wine he'd brought from the ship, he stepped forward and held it up to the Cyclops. I brought this as a gift, he said, hoping for your help. But I can see that you're too wild and savage to appreciate good wine. The Cyclops snatched the bowl out of his hands and drank the wine in a single gulp. Then he rolled his single glaring eye and held out the bowl. More, he growled. And when you've poured it, tell me your name. I have a gift for you too. Odysseus nodded and smiled, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He just filled the bowl again, and then again after that, and again. The Cyclops went on guzzling the wine, not realizing how strong it was. Gradually, his speech slurred and his eye glazed over. When he was totally drunk, Odysseus spoke at last. You asked for my name, he said. I'll tell you. I'm called Nobody. Now, where's the gift you promised me? The Cyclops rolled his eye and bellowed with laughter. Here it is. I promise to eat all your companions before I eat you. Isn't that a fine gift? I'll save you until last. He roared with laughter again and then slumped over onto his back. In less than a minute, he was snoring drunkenly. As soon as he was unconscious, Odysseus ran to the back of the cave to fetch the pole he had sharpened. Once again, he and his men plunged it into the fire, but this time they held it there until it was red hot. Then, when it was just about to burst into flames, they lifted it out and raised it high into the air. Then they drove it with all their strength into the Cyclops' one enormous eye. He awoke with a scream, knocking them out of the way as he jumped to his feet, and he went on screaming as he struggled to pull the stake out of his eye. The noise awoke every other Cyclops on the hillside, and they all came racing down from their homes, shaking the ground like an earthquake. "What's the matter, Polyphemus?" they yelled. "Why are you shouting like that? Who's in the cave with you?" "Nobody," Polyphemus shouted. "Nobody's here." The other giants were baffled. "Has someone hurt you?" they yelled. "Do you want revenge?" "Nobody has hurt me," Polyphemus bellowed. "I want revenge on nobody." "Then why are you making such a fuss?" the others shouted angrily. "Be quiet and let us sleep." They stomped away up the hill, leaving Polyphemus blundering around the cave in agony. The worse the pain grew, the more he wanted revenge. When morning came, he rolled the stone away from the mouth of the cave to let the sheep go out to pasture. But he was determined not to let his enemies escape. Sitting down in the entrance, he stretched out his great arms, running them over the ground to make sure that only sheep got past him. So Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is blind now. The sailors looked desperately at one another. Oh, and there's all the other Cyclops coming to help. How can we help? But he's saying, "No, nobody's hurting me." So they're saying, "Oh, okay, well, nobody's hurting you. We're going to go back to bed." The sailors looked desperately at one another. What could they do now? If they tried to sneak out with the sheep, they were sure to be caught. But Odysseus had thought of that and made another plan. While it was still dark, he tied the Cyclops' great sheep together in threes, knotting willow twigs into their thick, curly wool. Now, without making a sound, he showed his men in sign language how to cling on underneath the middle sheep. Once they were up, he tied them securely into place. As soon as he let the sheep go, they trotted toward the mouth of the cave. Polyphemus ran his hand over their backs, around their feet, searching for the sailors. But the men were hidden in the thick wool and protected by sheep on each side, and he didn't find them. One by one, they were carried out of the cave until only Odysseus had left. All the sheep had gone now, except the big ram that led the flock. Jumping up underneath it, Odysseus clung to its fleece. He twisted his arms and legs into the wool as the animal trotted toward Polyphemus. "Oh, my ram," Polyphemus said when he felt its horns. "Why are you last instead of leading the way? What's the matter with you?" He kept the ram in front of him, running his hands over it. Underneath, Odysseus held his breath as the thick fingers came toward him. They were just about to touch his shoulder when Polyphemus stopped and let out a great sigh. "You stayed behind because you're sad, didn't you, dear ram?" he said. "You know I've been hurt. If I could find nobody, that treacherous weakling, I would beat his brains out. Oh, if only you could tell me where he is." For a second he paused, almost as though he expected the ram to speak. Then he let it go and it trotted out of the cave. Odysseus loosened his cramped hands and jumped down. Quickly he untied his men and they all raced toward their ship, herding the fat sheep with them. It would have been the perfect escape if only Odysseus had kept his mouth shut. But he didn't. As the ship left the shore, he ran to the stern and yelled triumphantly at Polyphemus. So I'm a treacherous weakling, am I, Cyclops? Well, this weakling has defeated you and given you the punishment you deserve. The Cyclops heard his voice and charged toward the sea with a roar. Heaving a great rock out of the ground, he flung it into the sea, aiming toward the sound. The splash set the ship rocking, and the sailors pleaded with Odysseus to be quiet, but he wouldn't stop shouting. So in this picture, we have how Odysseus tied 3 sheep together, and one soldier would hide under the middle sheep. That way they could sneak out one at a time. And Polyphemus, there with the big pole still jabbing into his eyeball, he would feel the sheep, but he wouldn't feel the soldiers sneaking out underneath. Do you want to know who was clever enough to trick you? He yelled at Polyphemus. Well, you can tell your friends it wasn't nobody. It was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. The Cyclops bellowed and lifted up his massive hands, calling out to the god Poseidon, who was his father. Father Poseidon, grant me revenge. Stop Odysseus from reaching his home in Ithaca. Or if he must reach home, let it be only after a long journey. Let him lose all of his companions and his ship and arrive in Ithaca like a wretch to find his home full of trouble. The sea swelled and thundered, boiling around Odysseus' ship. His men pulled at their oars, desperate to return to the island where they had left their comrades and the other 11 ships. They were terrified of being wrecked before they could reach it. But by morning, there they were, and everything was calm. The sea slapped softly on the beach under a clear sky. It seemed that Polyphemus' curse had dissolved like a puff of wind. But it hadn't. Deep under the river of ocean, Poseidon, the earth shaker, had heard the voice of his son. Rearing up his mighty head, he scanned the wine-dark sea until he found Odysseus and his tiny fleet of 12 longships. Shaking the tangled locks of his hair, Poseidon began to watch them. Shaking the tangled locks of his hair, Poseidon began to watch them. So here we have a little map. There's Crete, Cyprus, Rhodes, all these little Greek islands here. Here's Ithaca, one of these little islands here. I don't know what these Greek letters mean. So these are the mainland and the little islands of Greek. And Odysseus is sailing around. Odysseus and his men are sailing around this ocean, trying to get back home to Ithaca.